Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Strange Pathways. I am your host, Scott Mort. I hope that you are having just an absolutely wonderful week. There is a lot to cover this week, especially our final tale. It's multi-layered to be sure, so let's just get right into it. Our first tale is going to take us all the way back to 1983, London. More specifically, the underground subway lines. There's this woman traveling with her family, Karen Collette. Her nephew says, "Hey, Aunt Karen, would you take a picture of me?" And she did. Now, you have to remember, these are not digital cameras. These are not cell phones. These are cameras that were used in 1983. Film. You had to snap the photo. It was a very simple camera. You popped the film out. You had to take it to be developed. When Karen does get the film developed, in the film, just as suspected, is Karen's nephew. But through the window behind her nephew, you can see the chest and arms of someone sitting in an electric chair. Even more oddly, from the wrists of whoever is in this electric chair is, and I am not kidding, cartoon lightning shooting out of the wrists. Now, a few things we have to remember as we go forward. Number one, it was a very simple camera. This would have been kind of hard to fake. Number two, at this point where the photo was taken, the train is moving. So, not only is it unlikely that what you're seeing is an advertisement of some sort behind Karen's nephew, but if it was, remember, simple camera, this isn't a high-speed camera. If this train is moving, then this photo would be a blur. And quite honestly, the image behind the nephew is just as sharp as the nephew himself. The film was investigated by Maurice Grosse, who is a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and he really couldn't find an explanation. Then Robert Cox, an expert from the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television, it used to be, now it's the Media Museum, the National Media Museum. He inspected the negative and the camera, and he said, and I quote, "It's an amateur point-and-shoot camera. So to do the manipulation of photographs, particularly in the 1980s, you would need sophisticated cameras." Maurice Grosse, though, this kind of bugs him, so he continues on with his investigation, and he finds an exact match for the figure in the window. It's a wax dummy from Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors. Now, the figure in question, the statue, is of Bruno Hauptmann. Now, Bruno Hauptmann, some of you know that immediately. Some of you probably don't know that. Some of you, it's kind of sticking in your head. He was convicted for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby in 1932. Which is its own case of strange. We may do a special on the Lindbergh baby sometime in the future. They were an exact match, except for the stylized, like the cartoon lightning bolts, of course. Now, was there an advertisement that was accidentally snapped? the Wax Museum said the Hopman wax statue has never been used in an advertisement. That's... If it was just a regular wax museum, I'd go, well, the records, poor record keeping, what have you. But this is Madame Tussauds. This is the wax museum. They would keep meticulous records, I would believe. It doesn't seem likely that they would lose that type of record. But things get just a little bit stranger. This is before the identity of the wax figure was discovered. Colette had taken a friend to get a reading from a medium, a psychic. And Colette is waiting outside for her friend. Her friend is the one going in and getting the reading. After, the medium walks out of the building where she conducts the business, and she says, "Are you Karen Colette?" "Yeah." "I have a message for you. It's about your photo. I just want you to know that the man said, I'm accused of something I didn't do, but I did something else." Now that doesn't really make sense to Colette at the time. Bruno Hauptmann went to his death strongly saying to anyone who would listen to him that he was innocent of killing the Lindbergh baby. A confession may have saved Bruno Hauptmann's life, but he stuck to it. And he said, "I did not kill Charles Lindbergh's baby." What the medium said doesn't really make sense until you factor in who the wax figure was of. Was this an interesting way of Bruno Hauptmann grabbing somebody's attention? Did Madame Tussauds simply forget that they had an advertisement? Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in Scotland, or the United Kingdom, or even the entire British Isles. The summit is 4,413 feet above sea level, and it's the highest land in any direction for almost 500 miles. It is very popular with climbers. It's thought that around 130,000 people climb this mountain every single year. We're going to go back to February 12th, 2015. As always, there are several groups of climbers. And they all hear, somewhere up in the clouds of Ben Nevis, a blood-curdling scream. One group of climbers actually abandoned their climb. They felt that they were really close. They wanted to investigate, but they didn't find anything. A lot of climbers called emergency service, and a mountain rescue team was dispatched. They found nothing. Where it gets weird is And I know it's sad, but it's not weird yet, is it? It wouldn't be uncommon to hear a scream and not find anything, especially in terrain which is as terrible as Ben Nevis. But it gets weird when later that day, a lot of people start to compare notes on a climber's forum page. They discover they all heard the scream, but everybody was on a different part of the mountain, and no one knows who screamed. Once all the notes were compared, the story starts to emerge. A series of sustained, horrific scream. One person, one of the climbers, a Christopher Slight, wrote that his first thought was that he was listening to someone who just saw somebody die, and not just a climbing partner, but a loved one, a family member, a wife, a husband, a daughter, a son, fall to their death. Christopher Slight said there was so much pain and loss that could be heard in that scream. That 4 or 5 minute scream. And then the sounds of a woman crying. A few of the climbers said that they heard cries for a tightrope just before the screams. Some people in the forum suggested that, hey, maybe what you were hearing was a deer's cry. But every climber that had heard the screams said, no mistake about it, they were human screams. No one was ever reported missing. No one. Nobody was able to locate the source of the scream. There were a lot of people who thought that it was a publicity stunt by Bear Grylls, who had been filming in the area, but it turned out that he was on a different mountain days earlier. Couldn't have been responsible for the screams. Were the screams supernatural? A lot of people thought so. A lot of people thought that it was a banshee, or that it was the scream of the big gray man, which is a creature that haunts the peak of Ben Macdui. We're not on Ben Macdui. We were on Ben Nevis. Or let me posit this to you. Whenever I was a teenager, my friends and I, we went up to this cliff on Mount Davis, Pennsylvania, called Wildcat Rocks. My friend Steve, he thought it would be funny to jump off the cliff. And he did. Steve's girlfriend, Marie, screamed her head off. Absolutely screamed her head off. Started to cry. I panicked. I ran over to the edge of the cliff, only to find that what had actually happened was, just over the edge of the cliff, not visible from our perspective, was a ledge that dropped about 3 feet down. And there was about 10 more feet of space to the actual edge of the cliff. What Steve had done was jump and then duck down and lay flat. It was a cruel joke. It was an absolutely cruel joke. Steve was single later that night, by the way, for anybody thinking to pull this off. What if this was a cruel joke? Somebody pulled a prank on their wife, their girlfriend, made it look like something horrible had happened. And then a little bit later on, after about 5-6 minutes, it turns out this woman, Steve, is just fine. They might be too embarrassed to admit they were the source of the screams. They may not have even known that they were being looked for. Buckle up, everyone. This is going to be a long, wild one. We're going to go back to 1966. And we're going to be dealing with the Christiansen family. Now we have, at the time, Edward Christiansen, who's 40, his wife Arlene, who's 38, his children, Connie, who is 17, Debbie, who is 13, and Eric, who is 9. We're going to have a few other witnesses in here. Gwendolyn Martino, Arlene's sister, Debbie Martino, who's 7 years old. So this is actually going to start November 22nd, 1966 at 7:45 p.m. We have all 7 of the witnesses, and they're driving south on the Garden State Parkway, just north of Mayville. They look up, and they all see this large, bright object directly in front of them, falling straight down. It's bright red, green, white, and it just falls straight down, and it disappears. Now, at first, the Christiansen family believes that this is a crashing airplane. They're a little freaked, understandably. They continue to drive along until they get to Burley, New Jersey. And then they see it. A large, glowing sphere flying just above the treetops. At first, they're thinking it's the fire from their crashed plane. They pull over to the side of the road and stop. And they all get out of the car. Their 1966 Cadillac. Brand new car. Edward's doing well. They realize that they're not looking at a fire. They're seeing some sort of flying sphere. It moves southwards a few miles, makes a very sharp turn, flies right back, and passes directly above the family. That's sending a message. That's sending the message, you saw me, and I saw that you saw me. It's silent. It's quiet. It's not making a noise at all. It's large. It's flying low. In the front of the objects, these 3 headlights, they appear at the front of this sphere. The object then disappears. It goes northwards. 2 of the children begin to cry. The women, they're a little bit freaked out. I'm willing to bet the men were pretty freaked out too. They calm down. They get in the car, and they drive home to Wildwood Crest, New Jersey. Edward Christiansen, he didn't believe in flying saucers. He knew that there was some sort of explanation. But his sister-in-law, Gwendolyn Martino, she calls the Air Force Base. There's one close in Palermo, New Jersey. She speaks to an officer. He's very attentive to her. He starts asking a lot of questions. An hour later, the Christiansen family receives a long-distance phone call from another Air Force base. Oddly enough, though, the family cannot remember the name of the base. They cannot remember the name of the officers. But they were all interviewed for a long time by 3 or 4 officers. They're told their questions, the answers, they're being taped, and it feels like there's like a pause after each question. It feels like forms are being filled out. Now, it's only going one way, though. The Air Force is getting all the information. The Christiansen family is not getting anything in return. No answers to their questions. Later on, Mrs. Martino is getting ready for bed. Her brother-in-law and sister are already in their room sleeping. She's in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, just getting ready for that long night's rest, when she suddenly hears what sounds like a radio broadcasting a series of dots and dashes, almost like Morse code. She's a little upset. She's thinking, my brother-in-law left his radio on. She's hearing this beep, this dash, beep, beep, dash, dash, beep, beep. And she goes into their bedroom and wakes them up. Radios were relatively new technology. And Mrs. Martino, she doesn't want to mess with it. She wakes up Mr. and Mrs. Christiansen. They're not able to hear them. They're not able to hear the dots and dashes. They can't hear the Morse code. And it doesn't matter. The radio's turned off. It's in a case. The signals faded. And Mrs. Martino, what else was there to do? She went to bed. Fast forward to December 9th, 1966. This is 2 weeks after their sighting. It's a little bit after 10 p.m. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Christiansen, they're going to get into their car outside of their home. And they look up. And there's a brilliant white object flashing overhead. It streaks overhead at a very high speed. Does this little squiggle, an S-shaped move, right over the towers of the Coast Guard electronic station near their home in Wildwood Crest. The object stops. Boom. Hovers for several seconds over the towers and then shoots straight up into the air. Disappears among the stars. But it leaves behind a cloud of smoke. The Christiansens are really, really shook to the core by this. Round about the same time, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Mrs. Martino, remember, she is Mrs. Christiansen's sister. She's getting ready for this quick trip to Europe. She gets this phone call. It's a female voice with a slight accent. Hello, Gwen. Gwen says, yes, this is Gwen. Gwen Stevens. No, this is Gwen Martino. You're not Gwen Stevens? No, you have the wrong Gwen. And she hangs up. For 2 nights in a row, the woman calls back. Conversation is always the same. It's important to point out that Gwen Martino has an unlisted phone number. Now, maybe this is coincidence. Maybe it was a woman dialing the same wrong number, and she's just happening to get another Gwen and made the mistake twice, 3 times. But like I said, it's a weird enough occurrence in this whole line of weird occurrences, because by God Almighty, we're not done yet. And it at least deserves to be in the evidence presented. The Christiansen family had been on a trip to Florida. We're now at January 7th, 1967, late into the night of January 8th. They decide that they're done for the night, and they're going to stop at a motel just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Now, they were driving north on Highway 95. They see a sign, there's a motel. They turn off. They go about 2 or 3 miles. They come to an old motel, and they check in. There's a few cars in the front, but the Christiansen family is assigned rooms in the back where there are no cars parked. Once again, something went on. They couldn't remember the name of the motel. They know it wasn't one of the larger chains. I stayed in little personal story. I stayed in a very odd motel whenever I was about 16 years old. And to this day, the motel was so odd. It was, instead of a shower, there was a pipe coming directly out of the ceiling. If you unplugged the lamp, my dad was on oxygen, so we had to plug his oxygen generation machine in. So whenever I unplugged the lamp, the innards of the cord stayed in the plug. It just fell apart in my hands. To this day, and there was nothing paranormal happening here. It was just odd, right? But to this day, I remember the name of that motel in northern Pennsylvania, the ABC Motel. Weird baby blue job with Looney Tune characters painted on the side. I can remember it like it was yesterday. So the fact that there's some odd stuff going on here and no one remembers the name, very odd. Anyway, continuing on. Mr. Ed Christiansen, he gets up to go to the bathroom, and he finds that none of the lights are working. Now remember, the Christiansens, they have family. Their daughter, Connie, she's 17 at the time. She's not in the room with her parents. She's in the adjoining room. No power there either. And they all think it's kind of strange that a motel turns its power off during the night. It is just an odd thing in another long line of odd things. I want you to keep that in your mind, though. Richmond, Virginia. Keep that in your mind. We're going to go forward in time. January 9th, 1967. It's a Monday. The Christiansen family arrives home. Now, they had recently moved. Their new house is quite a distance from their old house. Their new phone number. I know this sounds weird. Back in the day, you only got telephone books once a year. You couldn't look up somebody on Google to find their new telephone number. Their new home address, their new phone number was not listed in the current phone book. They didn't give their address out in any of the strange interviews they had. The front door is bolted and locked. They're tired from their long drive back from Florida. It's 5:30 p.m. There's a knock at the door. Arlene Christiansen was just making up a quick dinner for everybody. The daughter, Connie, she looks out the window to see who's knocking. Arlene says, if it's a salesman, don't answer. The daughter, Connie, says, it's the strangest looking man I've ever seen. Mrs. Christiansen goes to the door, opens it. It's cold. Remember, it's New Jersey. It's January. It's cold. It's 5:30. It's getting dark. There's no car on the road outside, but there's a man on the doorstep. And the man says, does Edward Christiansen live here? Arlene says, yeah. This man, and I'm using that term very loosely, he may not have been human. But the man says, I'm from the Missing Heirs Bureau. Mr. Christiansen may have inherited a great deal of money. May I come in? Mrs. Christiansen, Arlene, she's a little stunned. So he says it again. Mr. Christiansen may have inherited a great deal of money. I would like to ask him some questions. It will take about 40 minutes. Money. I mean, it motivates a lot of us. All of us, really. Mrs. Christiansen steps back and invites the stranger in. Now, a little bit about Edward. Edward Christiansen is 6'2" tall. This man, the stranger at the door, towered over him. He's somewhere around 6'6" to 7 foot tall and enormously broad. He wore a furry hat. The Christiansen family said it was the hats that Russians wear. But this one has a black visor on it. His hat's black. His coat's black. It's got 2 ordinary side pockets in it. It's a very long coat made of a very, very thin material that should have been too cold for a January night in New Jersey. This stranger, let's call him what he is, this man in black, comes in their house, removes his hat. The Christiansen family, Ed, Arlene, Connie, are just staring at him. Once again, he says, the interview will only take 40 minutes. And then he flashes a card that has his picture on it and some writing. But once again, here's the memory problems. None of the witnesses can remember what the writing on the card said. Edward looks at him and goes, buddy, There's got to be some sort of mistake. There's nobody that would have left me any money. But the man goes, no, you might be. You might be the Edward Christiansen we're looking for. The man removes his coat, the man in black, and there's a badge on his shirt. But he quickly covers it with his hand, removes it, and puts it in his coat pocket. Connie, the daughter, Connie gets a good look at it. She said it looked like a gold or brass badge, but not an ordinary police badge. It looked like it had a big K on it with a small X beside of it. And there are some letters or numbers around the edge. But it was really, really obvious that he didn't want us to see it. This man in black, his head was unusually large, unusually round, but the face seemed pointed, angular. Black hair closely cropped to his head. Almost as if the head had been shaved with a razor right down to the scalp and was just growing back again. And then on the back of the head, there's a perfectly round spot that's shaved right to the skin. His ears seemed to jut out, but they said that might have been because of the lack of the hair. Nose, mouth, really normal, but his eyes were large, set far apart, and sticking out, protruding. Almost as if he had been suffering from a thyroid problem. His body was very broad and fat, but the arms and legs were very, very thin, especially comparing them to the rest of the body. The skin was pale, a deathly white, no body hair at all on his arms and legs, no facial hair at all. One of his eyes seemed to have a sheen on it, like it was made of glass. The eyes didn't move together. They would look in opposite directions at the same time, much like a chameleon does. The man in black, whenever he sat down, his pant leg rode up his calves. And Connie and Arlene saw that there was this long, thick green wire attached to the inside of his leg. It come out of his socks, disappeared up his trousers. And it wasn't just laying beside the skin, but it was indented into his leg. And it goes into a large brown spot at one point on his calf. His speech was very strange. His voice was high and tinny. It was unusual to see that soft, tinny voice coming from such a large man. The picture I got in my head was almost like the sensation you get whenever you see the serial killer Ed Kemper talk. Ed Kemper was a massively giant man, but he had this very soft voice. You would look at him and you would think like his voice would be deep and booming, but no, very soft voice. This man in black, he spoke in a dull, emotionless tone, clipped his words and phrases. The daughter, Connie, she said he sounded like he was reciting everything, that he had memorized everything very, very carefully. All the witnesses, though, even with everything, they thought they were being visited by a human being. It never occurred to any of them that it could have been anything else. They're not even connecting it with the UFO sighting that they had earlier at this time. The man had introduced himself, but once again, the memory problems. None of the family could remember the name. They said it was something common, like Brown, Smith, Jones, something like that. But they did remember that he said his friends all called him Tiny. The family dog, Gigi, hated him. But he looked at the dog, spoke to it, and the dog calmed. Mrs. Christiansen looked at Tiny and said, "Hey, we were about to eat. Would you like to join us?" And he said that he was on a diet, but he would like a glass of water in 10 minutes. And then he wheezed. They said it was like having a man with asthma talking to you, that he had difficulty breathing. Tiny pulls out a small notebook and pen and tells them the interview will take about 40 minutes. He then asks all these questions. He wanted to know if Ed had any scars or birthmarks, which, okay, for an investigator saying that, hey, you might be the heir to some money, yeah, that's honestly a reasonable question. Ed said, yeah, I have a scar on my back from an operation and an appendix scar. Tiny asked for every detail, the length, width, exact position of the scars. He wanted a list of all the schools Ed had attended. He didn't care about Ed's marital or family history. He didn't care about Mrs. Christiansen. There was one point where he asked the couple if they would be willing to fly to any place in the United States to collect the inheritance. He said they would have to be present when the will was read. Ed and Arlene said, yeah, we can do that. It's at this point that Tiny tells them he is from Richmond, Virginia. That's a little odd. And then Tiny tells him, I don't have a car, but I met a plastic salesman at the Elks Club in Richmond. The plastic salesman was driving to New York and he gave me a lift, and he had dropped me off at your home and gone for coffee, but it would pick him up later. It didn't hit them as odd then, but I'm sure it's hitting you all as odd right now as I'm saying it. Some guy you just met in a bar, he's going to pick you up, gives you a lift for hundreds of miles? Because the plastic salesman was going to New York. Wildwood, New Jersey is pretty far. It's not on the way. Tiny then asks Ed for all the details about the cars he's owned. But his face is growing redder and redder and redder. And after a few minutes, he turns to the girl and says, may I have that glass of water now? So Connie runs out and grabs the glass of water, and he takes out this giant yellow capsule, pops it in his mouth, and washes it down. The face returns to what's normal for Tiny. And he continues to ask these questions. Tiny writes down all of Ed's answers, but he was writing rapid fire shorthand, but an indecipherable shorthand. None of them could duplicate any of the symbols that he used. None of the family could remember exactly what he was writing or even come close. Tiny then mentions 3 names and asks Ed if he recognized any of them. Once again, he's not really clear on what the names were. But Ed seems to remember the name Roy Stevens. Connie said she might have thought another one of the names was Taylor, but she couldn't really remember. But they were all common names. Do you remember the wrong numbers that Gwen was getting? Gwen Stevens. Once again, what seemed like a little tiny, maybe this doesn't fit in, all of a sudden looks like it's going to fit in a lot nicer. Less than an hour after he arrives, and let's be honest here, it was probably exactly 40 minutes. Tiny closes his notebook, puts on his thin coat, puts on his weird Russian fuzzy hat with the visor, and tells Ed that you'll be notified by mail within 10 days, and we'll let you know whether or not you're the missing heir. Arlene's in the kitchen, and she decides she's going to watch him out the window, Tiny, and see where he goes. She can't get a good look, so she walks out of the kitchen door and stands in the dark as Tiny walks towards the road. Tiny reaches the road. He makes a gesture with his hand, and a black 1963 Cadillac drives through the trees. Headlights are off. Can't see the driver. Tiny climbs in the car, and it drives away, headlights still off. Now, the next morning, Ed's alone in the house. The phone rings. There's a female voice, and it says, "We've located the Edward Christiansen we're looking for in California." You want just a little bit more oddness? Right before Tiny left, he's standing by the door, and he recites a riddle to Connie and Ed. Rattled it off very fast. It all rhymed, and it took him 10 minutes to tell it, but it didn't make any sense. Ed remembered it involved dogs, about dogs piddling here and piddling there and piddling all over. But Tiny never explains the riddle. Connie and Ed say they can't answer it. He just looks at them and says, "Good night," and leaves. We're going to shoot ahead about 4 days after the interview. January 13th, 1967. Mrs. Martino is visiting her sister and brother-in-law, Arlene and Ed. Gwen is sharing Connie's room. At 3 a.m., they hear this strange sound, like someone hammering on metal with a rubber mallet, maybe walking over a metal surface with rubber-soled shoes. And they seem distant at first, but they grow louder and louder until they're deafening, and the whole house is shaking. Gwen gets up to investigate, and the sounds stop immediately. As soon as she's back in bed, they begin again. They get up, and the sounds stop again and again and again. This weird rubber mallet metal sound. It's right outside the house. But then the sounds fade away. The next day they go outside and look at the house. They don't find anything unusual. 2 nights later, Connie is with her 19-year-old boyfriend alone in the house. It's about 10 p.m. and they hear it again. And this time they are hearing heavy footsteps on the layer of snow outside. The boyfriend goes over to the window, pulls the curtain aside to look out, and he sees a strange figure hurrying across the snow away from the house. It's tall, but it's wearing a long white cape. It runs across the lawn, gets to a fence about 5 feet high, and just leaps over it like a tiny little hop, but a tiny hop that's 5 foot high, and disappears. Connie and her boyfriend are scared. They don't go outside. Mr. and Mrs. Christiansen, they come home right afterwards, and they find the two very scared. They go out, they examine the area for footprints, and they find these large human footprints. They go right up to the fence. They continue on the other side. And then those footprints go on to another building some distance away. They stop right at the wall of a building. There are no other footprints around the building, which was an abandoned shed. They just stop. And that's where this tale ends. It's terrifying to think that you may be driving along one day. You see a bright light in the sky. And then for the next indeterminate amount of time, your life turns into a Twin Peaks-esque hell. Just like David Lynch is sitting down and writing your life out. Just one thing. I can't even say that one thing is weirder than the other. Just a little weird, a lot weird. A little weird, tons of weird, a little weird, maybe not as weird, pretty strange. And it's not even escalating. It's all over the place. It has to be maddening. It absolutely would be maddening. And my heart goes out to the Christiansen family. It was a long time ago, 1967. But my heart goes out to them. Thank you once again for joining us here on Strange Pathways. Please head over to our Twitter, Pathways Strange. We're going to have some stuff up there. TikTok and Instagram, Strange Pathways Podcast. During the week, I have little 1 minute and less episodes. They'll also go up on our YouTube page as well. I don't upload them to Spotify or anything like that. But TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, we're going to have a ton of stuff up there throughout the week. Little 1 minute mysteries, as it were. If you'd like to email us, you can do so at strangepathwaysmail@gmail.com. Please get a hold of me. Let me know some of the unusual stuff in your life. I would be honored if you could share that with me. Thank you once again for joining us. Take care of yourselves and each other.